All right, so today we're going deep on something pretty interesting. Two things, actually, and you might be surprised at the pairing.
Yeah, this should be a fun one.
We're looking at Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, and alongside that, we have this channeled material called The Law of One. So quite a pair, right?
Yeah, at first glance, you wouldn't think there'd be much overlap.
Not at all. But that's kind of what makes it so interesting.
Exactly. We're going to dig into both of these using the sources you sent us
Yeah.
and see what kind of surprising connections we might find.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll be able to pull out some of those key insights and maybe some aha moments too, without getting too bogged down in the details.
Definitely.
So, I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with Little Women. It's such a classic, the March sisters, Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy,
Mhm.
and their lives in 19th century New England. And the excerpts you sent really show their individual journeys.
Yep.
Meg wanting those fine things, but also deeply in love with John, Joe's just total independence in her writing, Amy the artist. I love that bit about the mud pies and then Beth with her music. It's just this beautiful coming of age story.
Absolutely. And at its heart, Little Women is really about the human experience. The characters trying to understand themselves, their place in the world, and going through all those ups and downs and ultimately learning and growing.
For sure, for sure.
Now, the Law of One, on the other hand, takes us to a very different place. This material claims to be channeled from a being or a group of beings called Ra, and it goes deep into some really big questions like the nature of reality, interconnectedness, the evolution of consciousness, even extraterrestrial contact.
Talk about a shift in perspective from Little Women to all of that.
Right, and the introduction to the material even calls it out as having high strangeness.
High strangeness is definitely one way to put it. I mean, this is a source that talks about the pyramids being built with thought
Yep.
and the stones themselves having consciousness.
Yeah, pretty far out there.
Yeah, so I guess our goal here is to see if there are any unexpected echoes or maybe even contrasts in how these two totally different sources address the same fundamental human experiences.
Right, because even though they come from completely different places and use completely different language, they might be getting at some of the same underlying truths.
I love that. So where should we start with all of this?
Well, maybe a good starting point would be that theme of self-improvement and spiritual growth, which is something that comes up a lot in Little Women. The sisters are always trying to be good, or as Meg puts it, be better.
Right, they even have those bundles they make representing their faults.
Exactly, and they're constantly talking about, getting out of the slough of despond, which is straight out of Pilgrim's Progress, but it's just such a relatable idea, that struggle to be better, to live up to your ideals.
Totally. And Marmee, their mother, is such a strong moral guide for them through all of that.
Yeah, she's definitely a source of wisdom and guidance for them.
Okay, so how does this idea of striving for improvement connect to what we see in the Law of One?
Well, it's interesting because Ross says that to teach learn is the law of one in one of its most elementary distortions. So in other words, the very act of trying to improve yourself, to learn from your mistakes, that's seen as like a fundamental expression of this universal law.
That's pretty deep.
And this whole journey through the different densities of consciousness that Ra talks about, it's basically a process of learning and evolving. And our current density, the third density, is described as a realm of intensive catalytic action for learning.
So you're saying that all the challenges the March sisters face, the little dramas, the big heartbreaks, those are all part of their third density curriculum.
Exactly. They're catalysts that push them to grow and learn, even if they don't think about it in those terms.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
And then Ra introduces this idea of the harvest, which is basically a transition to higher densities based on whether you're oriented towards service to others or service to self.
Interesting. So where do you think the March sisters fall on that spectrum?
Well, they're always putting family first. They're helping out the Hummels. They're showing kindness to Mr. Lawrence. It definitely seems like they're leaning towards a service to others orientation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Now, speaking of challenges, the March sisters face plenty of those too, like poverty, societal limitations, their own personal flaws, and just the general struggles of growing up.
Right, like Joe's temper or Amy's vanity.
Yeah, exactly. And all of that is in stark contrast to the kinds of challenges described in the Law of One.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're talking about a quarantine around Earth, the influence of this Orion group, which is all about control and domination, and even psychic attacks.
Exactly. It's a whole different level of challenge.
But I wonder if maybe in both cases, those challenges serve a similar purpose.
What do you mean?
Well, maybe they both provide the necessary friction for growth and evolution. Whether it's on a personal level, like with the March sisters, or a planetary level, like what's being described in the Law of One.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
So what about love and relationships? That's like the heart of Little Women, right?
Absolutely. The bond between the sisters, the romantic relationships, the kindness they show each other, it's all so central to the story.
And then there's Meg and John Joe and Lori and Amy and Lori.
Right. All these different forms of love and affection.
So how does the Law of One address love?
Well, it talks about love, especially unconditional love, as being absolutely essential for activating higher energy centers within a person and for forming deep connections.
Like a spiritual kind of love.
Exactly. And it even mentions the transfer of energy through physical expressions of love, like in a committed partnership.
So on one hand, you have Little Women showing us the very real and sometimes messy side of love. And then the Law of One presents this more cosmic understanding of love as a force for spiritual growth and connection.
Exactly. Two different perspectives on the same fundamental human experience.
I like that. Okay, so what about creativity? The March Sisters are always doing something creative, whether it's their plays or Joe's writing or Amy's art.
Yeah, those plays are so much fun, the way they describe them, all those makeshift props and costumes.
Right, and Joe's just determined to be a writer. She gets encouragement, but also criticism.
It's a classic story of an artist finding their voice.
Totally. So how does creativity fit into the Law of One?
Well, there's this concept of the Blu-ray sender of energy streaming, which is all about expressing yourself and being open to new ideas.
So it's about communication, both giving and receiving.
Exactly. And Ross says that if you have a blockage in this area, it can show up as difficulty expressing yourself creatively or being open to new ideas.
So maybe the March Sisters' struggles and successes with their creative pursuits could be seen as like a reflection of this Blu-ray energy.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it.
Okay, so let's talk about reality itself, because, we don't want to force connections. But I can't help but notice that the March Sisters go through so many transformative experiences, both happy and sad. And that seems to kind of echo what the Law of One says about how we learn in this third density.
Right, like Beth's illness, the impact that has on everyone, or Joe's journey of figuring out who she is and what she wants.
Exactly, those moments of both joy and sorrow. They're so important for their development.
And in the Law of One, it talks about how those intense experiences, the good and the bad, they act as catalysts for learning and growth.
Okay, so that makes sense.
And then there's this idea of the veiling process, which is the separation between our conscious and unconscious minds. And Ross says that's done to enhance our experience of free will.
Interesting, and maybe that ties into how the characters in Little Women sometimes have these limited perspectives or misunderstand each other because of the veil.
Right. It creates that space for them to exercise their free will, to make choices and learn from the consequences.
Okay, so it's a more subtle connection, but it's definitely there.
And finally, let's talk about service because, we've already touched on how the March Sisters are always willing to help others.
Right, like Meg and Joe working to support the family.
Exactly. And that aligns so well with what the Law of One says about service to others being a positive path for spiritual evolution.
And Ra talks about how the Confederation of Planets offers help to those who ask for it.
Right. And the level of help is always in proportion to the need, and it's always in alignment with free will.
Wow, so even though the March Sisters are motivated by love and family, their actions embody this principle of service.
Definitely.
So I think it's amazing how we've been able to find all these connections between Little Women and the Law of One.
Yeah, it just shows that even though they're so different in their style and scope, they both offer such profound insights into the human experience.
Little Women gives us this really down-to-earth, relatable picture of how people grow and change within a specific time and place.
And the Law of One provides this vast cosmic framework for understanding our existence. It introduces these concepts that can really challenge our usual ways of thinking.
So it makes you wonder, how might the lives of the March Sisters, with all their everyday struggles and triumphs, how might those be seen through the lens of this larger spiritual journey that the Law of One describes?
Right. And even though these sources are so different, they both explore themes of love loss, growth connection. Does that mean there are some universal truths about what it means to be human?
Such good questions, things to really think about.
Exactly. And we encourage you to go back to these works, explore them on your own, see what other insights you can find.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, keep those minds curious.